The imperial examination system gave him failure, branding him a failed scholar, and he responded by becoming the greatest professor of the art of betrayal. He ended a 2,000-year-old dying dynasty, only to then strangle the infant democracy he had helped deliver. He did not bring peace. He brought a cleansing fire, a necessary chaos to burn the old world to the ground, clearing the path for something new to be born from the ashes. In the end, who was he? A traitor or a storm of destiny? Perhaps Yuan Shikai was both. His legacy is a terrible lesson, written in fire and blood, that sometimes the only cure for a dying civilization is a merciless act of arson, and that for a nation to be reborn, it must first be burned to the ground by its own most ruthless son. But before the arsonist, there must be the tinderbox, an empire on its knees, the China of the mid-19th century. To an outsider, and indeed to many within its own sclerotic bureaucracy, the great Qing dynasty still projected an aura of immense, unshakable power. It was a civilization that measured its history not in centuries, but in millennia. Its emperors were the sons of heaven, mediators between the celestial and terrestrial realms, and its domain was Tianxia, all under heaven. But this was a magnificent, rotting facade. The celestial mandate was wearing thin, and the foundations of the world were cracking. The rot had begun from the outside in. For decades, Western powers, led by the British Empire, with its insatiable hunger for trade, and its military machine powered by the Industrial Revolution, had been knocking, no, hammering, on China's doors. They brought with them marvels of engineering and insidious new ideas, but their most potent weapon was opium. The drug, grown in British India and funneled into China against imperial decree, became a silver hemorrhaging plague, addicting millions and draining the imperial treasury. When the Daoguang emperor finally tried to stamp out the trade in 1839, the British responded not with diplomacy, but with cannonballs. The First Opium War was a cataclysmic shock. It was a confrontation not between two armies, but between two different centuries. The Qing's medieval war junks were obliterated by steam-powered ironclad gunboats. Their matchlock rifles and cannons were no match for modern artillery. The result was a humiliation so profound it sent a shudder through the entire Confucian world order. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of the unequal treaties, a series of documents signed at gunpoint that ceded territory, forced open ports to foreign trade, demanded massive indemnities, and granted foreigners the right of extraterritoriality, meaning they were not subject to Chinese law. The Celestial Empire, the center of the world, was being carved up by what it had for centuries considered red-haired, uncivilized barbarians. This external humiliation ignited the fires of internal collapse. The government's inability to protect the nation shattered its prestige. Misery, always a feature of peasant life, now boiled over into apocalyptic rage. This was the fertile ground for the Taiping Rebellion, a cataclysm that defies easy description. It was a civil war, a religious crusade, and a social revolution all at once. Its leader, Hong Xiuquan, was a failed civil service examination candidate who, after a nervous breakdown, declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to slay demons and establish the heavenly kingdom of great peace. What began as a provincial cult exploded into a full-scale war that engulfed the heartland of China. The Taiping armies, driven by a fanatical zeal, captured the great city of Nanjing and made it their capital. They instituted radical, bizarre policies. The sexes were segregated, property was held in common, and their version of Christianity replaced Confucianism and Buddhism. The Qing court, with its corrupt and ineffective Manchu banner armies, was powerless to stop them. For 14 years, China tore itself apart. When the rebellion was finally crushed, not primarily by the imperial government, but by new regional Han Chinese armies organized by provincial scholar officials, the cost was staggering. An estimated 20 to 30 million people were dead, more than the entire population of the United States at the time. Vast swathes of the country's most fertile land were depopulated and destroyed. This was the China that Yuan Shikai was born into on September 16, 1859, in the village of Zhangying, Henan Province. Not a realm of celestial harmony and Confucian order, but a failing state teetering on the brink of total collapse. The air was thick with the smoke of rebellion, the stench of decay, and the palpable fear that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn. In this world, the old rules were dying. The scholar's brush was still revered, but it was the general's sword that now held the true power. This was a world that did not reward loyalty to a distant failing throne, but rather rewarded ambition, pragmatism, and brute strength. It was the perfect crucible in which to forge a man like Yuan Shikai. Yuan's family was not part of the high-ranking Manchu nobility that ruled from the Forbidden City in Beijing. They were Han Chinese, a family of local gentry who had made their fortune through land and, more importantly, through military service. They were part of a new class of men who understood a fundamental truth of their era. In a world without order, strength is the only currency that truly matters. Yuan's biological father and several uncles had been involved in fighting the Nian Rebellion, another massive, brutal uprising that raged across northern China concurrently with the Taiping War. From his earliest days, Yuan was surrounded by the talk of battle, logistics, and the cold calculus of power. He was a boisterous and physically imposing youth, more interested in horsemanship, boxing, and drinking with friends than in the quiet, disciplined study of the Confucian classics. This was a source of great concern. For centuries, the one true path to prestige, power, and wealth in China was the imperial civil service examination system. It was a grueling, multi-tiered ordeal that required candidates to memorize vast tracts of classical literature and philosophy and compose intricate essays in a highly stylized form. Success meant an official post, honor for one's family for generations. Failure meant obscurity. Yuan, pushed by his family's expectations, attempted the exams. He failed. He tried again. He failed again, this time spectacularly. For a young man from a prominent family in a society that revered scholarship above all else, this was a crushing public humiliation. It was a clear sign that he was not destined for the traditional path of the scholar official. The door to legitimate orthodox power had been slammed shut in his face. But Yuan was nothing if not pragmatic. If the front door was closed, he would find a side entrance. His family's military connections provided the key. Instead of a scholar's robes, he would don a soldier's uniform. In 1881, he purchased a junior official title, a common practice for wealthy men who couldn't pass the exams, and used his family's influence to join a Qing army unit. This was not the path of a gentleman, it was the path of a striver, an opportunist, and it led him, in 1882, to the place that would become his personal laboratory of power, the Kingdom of Joseon, Korea. Korea in the late 19th century was a tinderbox. For centuries, it had existed as the Hermit Kingdom, a loyal vassal state to the Qing Empire, paying tribute to Beijing and modeling its government on Chinese Confucian principles. But this ancient relationship was being threatened by a new, aggressive power in the East, the Empire of Japan. Fresh from the Meiji Restoration, Japan was modernizing at a breathtaking pace and was eager to cast off its own history of subservience to China. It saw Korea as the first crucial step in its expansionist ambitions, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan that it must control. Into this vortex of intrigue stepped the 23-year-old Yuan Shikai. He was part of a Chinese force sent to help the Korean court handle a military mutiny. From the moment he arrived, he stood out. While other Qing officials were often arrogant, condescending, and wrapped up in the formal rituals of superiority, Yuan was different. He was direct, energetic, and possessed an unnerving ability to read the political landscape. He learned the Korean language, cultivated allies within the court, and understood that power flowed not from ancient texts, but from the men with guns. His defining moment came just 2 years later in 1884 during the Gapsin coup. A small group of pro-Japanese Korean reformers, frustrated with the slow pace of change and backed by Japanese legation guards, stormed the royal palace in Seoul. They murdered conservative ministers and seized King Gojong, announcing a new government that would sever ties with China and follow the Japanese model. The Chinese contingent, outnumbered and caught by surprise, was in disarray. Their commander was indecisive. Panic set in. Yuan Shikai, however, saw not a crisis but an opportunity. Without waiting for clear orders, he took command. Rallying the Chinese troops, he made a simple, brutal calculation. He did not have enough men for a prolonged siege or a complex maneuver. The only option was a direct, all-out assault on the palace. He personally led the charge, his soldiers smashing through the palace gates. In the bloody, chaotic fighting that followed, the Japanese-backed coup was crushed. Yuan's forces rescued the terrified Korean king and queen, effectively ending the rebellion. The Gapsin coup transformed Yuan Shikai from an unknown junior officer into a hero. He had acted decisively while others dithered. He had used force ruthlessly to achieve a clear political objective. In the eyes of the Qing court, he was the man who had single-handedly saved Korea for the empire. His star began to rise. Over the next decade, from 1885 to 1894, Yuan became the de facto ruler of Korea. His official title was modest, but his power was absolute. He was, in effect, China's unofficial viceroy, the strongman of Seoul. He controlled the country's foreign policy, advised the king on all major appointments, and took charge of training and equipping a new, modern Korean army. He treated Korean officials not as colleagues, but as subordinates, and Western diplomats learned that if you wanted anything done in Korea, you didn't go to the king, you went to Mr. Yuan. One Western diplomat noted in a cable back to his government, "Mr. Yuan is a man to be watched. He is not like the other Qing officials, lost in ceremony and precedent. He is direct, forceful, and understands power in a way that is familiar to us. He operates on the principle that the strong dictate terms to the weak, a sentiment we understand well. In this chaotic corner of the world, he is the only force for stability, a necessary strongman." This decade in Korea was Yuan's political and military apprenticeship. He learned how to play rival factions against each other. He mastered the art of training soldiers who were loyal not to an abstract state, but to their direct commander. He learned the nuances of international diplomacy, dealing with Japanese, Russian, and Western agents, all vying for influence. But his very success contained the seeds of disaster. His aggressive, overbearing presence deeply alienated many Koreans and pushed the Korean government to secretly seek other patrons, including Russia and, ironically, Japan, to counterbalance China's suffocating influence. His actions, meant to secure China's dominance, were instead creating the very conditions for the conflict that would destroy it. The final spark came in 1894. A massive peasant rebellion, the Donghak Rebellion, erupted in southern Korea. The beleaguered Korean king, as was tradition, requested Chinese troops to help suppress the revolt. China sent a force, with Yuan Shikai at its head. Under the terms of a prior convention, Japan used this as a pretext to send its own, much larger and more modern army to Korea, claiming a need to protect its citizens and interests. Yuan immediately recognized the extreme danger. He saw that Japan was not there to quell a rebellion, but to start a war. He knew the decrepit state of the Qing military better than anyone. He frantically wired his superiors in Beijing, warning them to avoid conflict at all costs. But the Qing court was hobbled by indecision and arrogance. Believing Japan would not dare to attack the Celestial Empire, they blustered and delayed. As tensions reached the breaking point, Yuan made a crucial self-serving decision. He arranged to be recalled to a post in China just before hostilities officially broke out. When the First Sino-Japanese War began in August 1894, Yuan Shikai was safely out of the line of fire. The war was a catastrophe for China, an even greater humiliation than the Opium Wars. The modern Japanese army and navy, which China had dismissed as belonging to a nation of dwarf pirates, annihilated the Qing forces on land and at sea. The Beiyang fleet, China's prized modern navy, was destroyed at the Battle of the Yalu River. The army in Korea was routed. The world watched in shock as the ancient giant was brought to its knees by its tiny, upstart neighbor. For the Qing dynasty, it was the ultimate humiliation, a blow from which it would never recover. It exposed the utter failure of decades of slow, half-hearted, self-strengthening reforms. The old armies had failed. The old commanders had failed. The court was stripped bare of its prestige, facing massive indemnity payments and the loss of territory, including Taiwan. The nation was in despair. But for Yuan Shikai, the man who had helped precipitate the crisis but cleverly avoided the blame, it was the ultimate opportunity. In the wreckage of the old order, China desperately needed to build something new. It needed a new army, built on modern principles. It needed a new kind of leader, one who understood the modern world and the brutal realities of power. The court, in its desperation, looked around for such a man. And there was Yuan Shikai, with his decade of experience in Korea, his reputation for ruthlessness and efficiency, and his intimate knowledge of modern military techniques. The door of the scholar had been slammed in his face. He responded by kicking down the door of the soldier. Rejected by the ancient world of the brush and the book, he chose to master the new world of the bullet and the bayonet. The crucible of Korea had forged him into a weapon. Now, he was returning to use that weapon on the very system that had once deemed him a failure. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was more than a document of surrender. It was a death certificate for the old Qing military. In the stunned silence of the Forbidden City, the Manchu princes were forced to confront a terrifying reality. The world had changed, and their armies of archers and spearmen were relics of a forgotten age. Out of this national wreckage, one man's name emerged as the only viable solution. Yuan Shikai, the ruthless operator from Korea, the one commander who understood the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare, was summoned from the ashes. The court saw him as their shield, their builder of a new sword to defend the throne. They failed to understand that Yuan Shikai only ever built weapons for himself. We left Yuan Shikai at a pivotal moment. The year is 1895, the great Qing dynasty. The empire that had ruled a quarter of humanity for over 2 centuries lies prostrate and humiliated. Its armies have been crushed, its modern navy annihilated, and its pride shattered by the Empire of Japan, a nation it had long dismissed as a student at best, an upstart pirate at worst. The First Sino-Japanese War was more than a military defeat. It was a civilization-level verdict. It proved that China's slow piecemeal attempts at modernization, the so-called self-strengthening movement, had been a catastrophic failure. The old ways were not just dying, they were dead and buried in the cold waters of the Yellow Sea. In the stunned corridors of the Forbidden City, a terrifying realization dawned. Without a new kind of army, there would be no dynasty left to rule. The old Manchu banner armies and the Green Standard Army were corrupt, opium-addled relics. The regional armies that had defeated the Taiping rebels were loyal to their provinces, not the throne. The court, in its moment of ultimate desperation, needed a man who understood the weapons, the tactics, and the brutal mindset of the modern world. And in this wasteland of failure, one man stood out. He had warned them about Japan. He had experience fighting modern battles. He had a reputation for getting things done. His name was Yuan Shikai. The disaster that had broken his country was about to make him its master. In late 1895, by imperial decree, Yuan Shikai was appointed to supervise the creation of a new military force. At a dusty, windswept training ground called Xiaozhan, near the port city of Tianjin, he began to build his masterpiece. This was not to be just another army. This was to be the newly created army, or as history would know it, the Beiyang Army. It was the machine that would carry Yuan to the pinnacle of power, and the engine that would later tear China apart. To understand Yuan's genius and his profound cynicism, one must understand what made the Beiyang Army different. It was not merely a matter of better guns. It was a fundamental revolution in the software of military power. First, there was the hardware. Yuan, a meticulous student of military logistics, secured German advisors and German equipment. The era of soldiers carrying matchlocks, spears, and banners emblazoned with fearsome tigers was over. The Beiyang soldiers were equipped with modern Mauser rifles and machine guns. Their artillery parks were filled with state-of-the-art Kruppfield guns, the most feared artillery in the world. For the first time, a Chinese army could match, and in some cases exceed, the firepower of a Western expeditionary force. Second, there was the discipline. Yuan instituted a rigid German-inspired training regimen. There was endless drilling, a focus on physical fitness, and even classes in literacy and mathematics for the common soldier. Hygiene was enforced. Uniforms were standardized. Opium smoking, the scourge of the old armies, was punishable by immediate execution. Yuan understood that a modern army was a complex organism that required every part to function with precision. He was building soldiers, not bandits in uniform. But the third and most crucial element, the feature that made the Beiyang Army truly Yuan's creation, was the cultivation of personal loyalty. This was his masterstroke. In the old imperial system, a soldier's loyalty was, in theory, to the distant divine emperor in Beijing. In reality, it was usually to whoever paid him last. Yuan systematically short-circuited this entire structure. He made sure his troops were the best paid, best fed, and best equipped in the empire. Their salaries arrived on time, a revolutionary concept in the corrupt Qing bureaucracy. He established a modern officer corps, promoting men based on merit and ability, not just on their family connections or their ability to bribe superiors. He bound these men to him through a web of patronage, obligation, and shared identity. The officer academies he founded taught that a soldier's primary duty was obedience to his direct commander. Cadets and officers swore personal oaths of allegiance not to the Qing, but to their superiors, and ultimately to Yuan Shikai himself. He knew all his senior commanders by name. He attended their weddings, supported their families, and made their careers. He systematically replaced the abstract, celestial loyalty owed to the Son of Heaven with the tangible daily loyalty owed to the man who filled their iron rice bowl. The soldiers of the Beiyang army did not serve a distant god in Beijing. They served the very real provider who stood before them. As a common Beiyang saying went, "I only know my commander and not the emperor." From this system emerged a cadre of ruthlessly efficient officers who would dominate Chinese politics for the next 30 years. The stoic Duan Qirui, the strategic Feng Guozhang, the brutal Cao Kun. They were not just Yuan's subordinates, they were his disciples. He had created more than an army. He had created a military political clique, a state within a state, whose loyalty was directed inward to its creator, not outward to the nation. While the Manchu princes in Beijing saw a new shield for their dynasty, Yuan Shikai was quietly forging a sword for himself. By 1898, Yuan's new army was the most formidable military force in China. This rising power placed him at the absolute center of a political hurricane brewing within the Forbidden City. The national humiliation at the hands of Japan had profoundly affected the young Guangxu emperor. For years, he had lived in the shadow of his powerful aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had been the true ruler of China for decades. Now, inspired by a group of radical scholars led by the brilliant philosopher Kang Yue, the emperor decided to act. In the summer of 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform, a breathtaking, frantic attempt to modernize China by imperial decree. In a flood of edicts, he ordered a complete overhaul of the state. The ancient civil service exam system was to be reformed, a modern university established in Beijing, a national railway system built, and the entire bloated Qing bureaucracy streamlined. It was a revolution from the top, an attempt to do in 3 months what the Meiji Restoration in Japan had taken 30 years to accomplish. The reforms electrified the young, progressive intellectuals of the empire. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that China might be able to peacefully transform itself into a modern constitutional monarchy. But to the conservative establishment, the powerful Manchu princes, the elderly Confucian officials, and the legions of bureaucrats whose jobs were now threatened, this was heresy. And their undisputed leader was the Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi had officially retired to the Summer Palace, but her web of influence and power remained intact. She saw the emperor's reforms not as an attempt to save China, but as a direct assault on the foundations of Manchu power and, more importantly, on her own authority. The court split into 2 warring factions: the emperor's party, full of idealistic scholars but possessing no real power, and the Empress Dowager's party, deeply entrenched and ruthless. As the summer wore on, the conservatives began to mobilize. It became terrifyingly clear to the reformers that Cixi was planning a coup to depose the emperor and crush their movement. The reformers knew they had no military backing. Their only hope lay with the man drilling his modern army just outside the capital. They had to win over Yuan Shikai. One desperate, moonless night in September, a leading reformer named Tan Sitong galloped to Yuan's military barracks. In a secret meeting, he laid the emperor's desperate plan bare. He begged Yuan to perform a great act of patriotic salvation, march his new army into Beijing, surround the Summer Palace to neutralize Cixi and her conservative allies, and protect the emperor so the reforms could continue. Here was the defining moment of Yuan Shikai's life, and a pivotal crossroads for all of modern Chinese history. The fate of 400 million people rested on the choice of this one man. He could side with the young, progressive emperor and use his military might to drag China, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. He could become the guardian of a new reformed China, or he could side with the old corrupt but still powerful establishment. Yuan listened intently. He made promises. He appeared to agree. He assured the frantic reformer that he would support the emperor. Tan Tong left the meeting filled with hope. Yuan Shikai made his choice. He did what all master gamblers do. He played the odds, not the ideals. The choice was never between reform and reaction, or between patriotism and treachery. It was a cold calculation of risk, and he bet everything on the brutal, predictable power of the past against the fragile, uncertain promise of the future. He analyzed the situation like a general surveying a battlefield. On one side was the emperor, idealistic, politically naive, and with a following of scholars who had never commanded a single soldier in their lives. On the other side was the Empress Dowager, a master of court intrigue, who had ruled China for over 30 years with a vast network of powerful and ruthless allies. For Yuan, the risk of siding with the emperor was immense, and the chance of success was slim. The reward for siding with Cixi, however, was almost limitless. After Tan Tong left, Yuan took a train to Tianjin. He went directly to the headquarters of Ronglu, the governor-general of the province, a staunch Manchu loyalist and Cixi's most trusted confidant. There, Yuan revealed the entire plot. The result was swift and brutal. Armed with Yuan's information, Cixi struck first. She returned to the Forbidden City, declared the emperor gravely ill and unfit to rule, and placed him under house arrest on a small island within the palace grounds. He would remain a prisoner for the rest of his life. A wave of arrests swept through the capital. 6 of the leading reformers, including the brave Tan Tong, were captured. Refusing a chance to flee, Tan declared, "No country in the world has ever been reformed without bloodshed. In China, let it begin with me." He and his 5 colleagues were summarily executed without trial. The 100 Days reform was over. All the modernizing edicts were rescinded. The hope for a peaceful top-down transition for China was extinguished, drowned in the blood of martyrs. The path of reform was now seen as a dead end. To patriots across the country, the lesson was clear. The Manchu dynasty was incapable of saving itself or the nation. It could not be cured. It had to be destroyed. Yuan Shikai's betrayal had inadvertently turned the dream of reform into the certainty of revolution. The exiled revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen wrote years later, "The name Yuan Shikai will be forever synonymous with treachery." On that day, he did not merely betray an emperor, he betrayed a nation's future. He slammed the door on peaceful change and forced open the gates of bloody revolution. Yuan, the great betrayer, was rewarded handsomely for his loyalty. He gained Cixi's unwavering trust. He was made governor of Shandong, a critical province. His new army was expanded and became the core of the dynasty's military power. He had gambled correctly, and the payoff was immense. Yuan's political acumen was tested again just 2 years later, during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. A bizarre, anti-foreign, anti-Christian peasant movement, fueled by drought and popular anger at foreign encroachment, swept across northern China. The Boxers, who believed their magical rituals made them impervious to foreign bullets, began killing missionaries and Chinese Christians. In a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, the Empress Dowager Cixi and her hardline Manchu advisors decided to endorse the Boxers and declare war on all 8 foreign powers at once. It was a suicidal act of imperial rage. Yuan Shikai, now governor of Shandong, was far too shrewd to be drawn into this madness. He understood the Boxers were a rabble, and that defying the Western powers was suicide. He performed a masterful tightrope walk between two forms of annihilation. Publicly, he followed the court's edicts. Privately, he refused to allow the Boxers to operate in his province, ruthlessly suppressing them. He protected foreigners and missionaries, assuring the foreign powers that he was a force for order, while northern China descended into a vortex of violence, and the international armies marched on Beijing to sack the capital and relieve the besieged legations. Yuan's province remained an island of calm. His Beiyang army remained intact, unbloodied by the fighting. When the dust settled, the Qing court was once again humiliated, forced to sign another crippling treaty and pay an astronomical indemnity. Cixi and the government were utterly discredited. But Yuan Shikai emerged stronger than ever. The foreign powers now saw him as a reliable, modern, and rational leader, a man they could do business with. The chastened Qing court, its own forces in ruins, was now more dependent on him and his Beiyang army than ever before. He was soon promoted to be the viceroy of Jili, the most powerful official in the empire, controlling the province surrounding Beijing itself. He was now the guardian of the throne, the indispensable man. For the next 7 years, Yuan's power was seemingly absolute. He was the great modernizer, overseeing reforms in education, law, and industry. He was the ultimate commander, expanding his Beiyang army into a force of 6 divisions that was the unquestioned military backbone of the state. He was at the zenith of his career under the dynasty, but his very power made the Manchu royal family deeply nervous. They saw that he, a Han Chinese, controlled the gun, and they knew it was not truly loyal to them. Their chance to act came in November 1908. In a 24-hour period that remained shrouded in mystery, both the imprisoned Guangxu emperor and the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi died. Power passed to a new regent, Prince Chun, the father of the infant Emperor Puyi. Prince Chun was the brother of the Guangxu emperor, and he harbored a deep personal hatred for the man who had betrayed his brother in 1898. One of his first acts as regent was to exact revenge. In early 1909, Yuan Shikai was stripped of all his posts and titles. The court did not dare to have him executed. His Beiyang commanders might revolt. Instead, they used a classic Chinese political maneuver to allow him to save face. An imperial edict announced that Yuan Shikai was suffering from a foot ailment and would be permitted to retire to his home village in Henan to recuperate. The most powerful man in China was overnight a private citizen. He retreated to a sprawling estate where he spent the next 3 years. He practiced calligraphy, wrote elegant poetry about the tranquility of nature, and posed for photographs dressed as a humble fisherman, complete with a fishing pole and a straw hat. He projected the perfect image of a great official in peaceful, contented retirement. It was all a magnificent act. He was not a fisherman. He was a spider, sitting motionless in the center of his web. He maintained a constant secret correspondence with his Beiyang commanders. Duan Qirui, Feng Guozhong, and the others still looked to him as their true leader. He received a stream of visitors, keeping himself perfectly informed of the political decay in Beijing. He was watching the dynasty he had once served and once betrayed rot from the inside out. The regent, Prince Chun, proved to be a weak and incompetent leader, alienating the provincial gentry and further concentrating power in the hands of a few Manchu princes, fanning the flames of Han Chinese nationalism. Yuan Shikai waited. He knew the dynasty was a hollow tree, ready to be pushed over by the slightest gust of wind. He knew that the revolutionaries, led by Sun Yat-sen, were plotting and gaining strength. He knew a storm was coming, and he knew that when it finally broke, the terrified Manchu court with no one else to turn to, would have to come begging for the fishermen to return and save them. He was not forgotten. He was waiting. For 3 years, the most dangerous man in China played the part of a forgotten retiree. While he posed for photographs with his fishing pole, the dynasty he had built his career on was rotting from the head down. The regent's weak and reactionary policies fanned the flames of Han nationalism, while underground revolutionary cells across the country plotted the final decisive blow. Yuan Shikai read the political currents as skillfully as he read his classical poetry. He knew the quiet was a facade. He was not just fishing in a pond. He was fishing in the turbulent river of history, waiting patiently for the moment the dynasty would fall, knowing that in the chaos to come, he would be the only one holding the net. We left Yuan Shikai in quiet, feigned retirement in his home village, posing as a humble fisherman while the Qing dynasty, the colossal political entity he had both served and betrayed, entered its death throes. For 3 years he had watched and waited, a spider in the center of a vast web of military loyalties, knowing that the brittle structure of Manchu rule was about to shatter. He knew that when the storm came, the call would come for him. In the autumn of 1911, the storm finally arrived. On the evening of October 9, 1911, in the Russian concession of the city of Hankou, a bomb accidentally exploded in the secret headquarters of a local revolutionary cell. The police raid that followed uncovered membership lists and plans for an imminent uprising against the dynasty. The revolutionaries in the adjacent city of Wuchang knew their cover was blown. They faced a stark choice: rise now or be arrested and executed. On the morning of October 10th, the double 10th, the soldiers of the Wuchang garrison's new army units mutinied. They seized the local mint and arsenal, and by the next day the entire city was in their hands. The Wuchang uprising had begun. It was in many ways an accidental revolution. Its leaders were mid-level officers, not the great revolutionary thinkers. The most famous of them all, Sun Yat-sen, was thousands of miles away on a fundraising tour in Denver, Colorado, and learned of the uprising, which would make him president, from a newspaper. But the accidental spark landed in a powder magazine. Decades of humiliation, corruption, and simmering Han Chinese resentment against their Manchu rulers exploded. Within weeks, province after province declared its independence from Beijing. The Qing dynasty was not just collapsing, it was evaporating. In the Forbidden City, there was absolute panic. The regent, Prince Chun, and the Manchu court were paralyzed by fear and incompetence. The modern military units they had in the north were useless, as they either joined the revolution or refused to fight. There was only one force in the empire that could stem the tide: the 6 divisions of the elite, German-trained Beiyang army, and there was only one man who could command them. The court was forced into the ultimate humiliation. They had to go, hat in hand, to the man whom Prince Chun had dismissed for a foot ailment 3 years prior. They had to beg Yuan Shikai to return and save the dynasty from the very revolution his earlier betrayals had made inevitable. Yuan, the master political actor, played his part to perfection. When the first emissaries arrived, he did not leap at the chance. He demurred. He explained that his foot ailment was still troubling him, that he was enjoying his retirement, and that he was perhaps not the man for the job. This was a calculated delay. He let the situation for the Qing fester and worsen. He let the panic in Beijing turn into sheer terror. He was waiting for them to become so desperate that they would agree to any price. The price for his service was nothing less than total power. When he finally, with carefully feigned reluctance, agreed to consider the post, His demands were absolute and uncompromising. He made it clear that he would not return as a mere general. He intended to be the master. His conditions stipulated supreme command over all military forces, including the Navy, giving him unquestionable authority on the battlefield. This was to be paired with the prime ministership, granting him the power to form his own cabinet and thus control the entire civil government. To fund his endeavors, he required a guaranteed and sufficient war chest with no questions asked. Lastly, to wipe the slate clean, he demanded a full amnesty, pardoning him for all past offenses. These were not the terms of a negotiation. They were the articles for a complete surrender of authority to him. The court, with the fires of revolution licking at its gates, had no choice. They agreed to everything. In a series of edicts in early November 1911, Yuan Shikai was made imperial commissioner, prime minister, and the undisputed military dictator of the Qing Empire. He had returned from his fishing pond as the dynasty's last hope and its absolute master. The fisherman, having patiently waited for the river to flood, had finally reeled in his catch, the dynasty itself. Yuan Shikai took command of his Beiyang army and immediately demonstrated why he was so feared. He moved south, and in a series of swift professional attacks, his forces crushed the revolutionary army at the Battle of Yangxia and recaptured the key cities of Hankou and Hanyang, which sat just across the river from the revolutionary capital of Wuchang. It was a bloody and brutal display of military superiority. The revolutionary soldiers, brave and zealous but poorly led and equipped, were no match for the disciplined veterans of the Beiyang machine. He had made his point. He had proven to the revolutionaries that they could not defeat him on the battlefield. He had shown the Qing court that he was indeed the only man who could save them. And then, at the very moment of victory, with Wu Cheng at his mercy, he ordered his armies to halt. This was the master stroke of a political genius. By stopping his advance, he preserved his leverage over both sides. If he completely crushed the revolution, the Qing court would no longer need him, and they could dismiss him once more. If he did nothing, the revolution would consume the dynasty, and he would go down with it. By positioning himself in the middle, as the one man holding the balance of power, he became indispensable to everyone. He was now the ultimate arbiter of China's fate. While his armies maintained their menacing posture, Yuan Shikai opened a second front, a campaign of negotiation and intrigue. He began secret communications with the revolutionaries. His message was simple and seductive. Why should we, as Han Chinese, continue this bloody fight for the sake of a failing Manchu dynasty? You cannot beat my army, but I can give you what you want. I can bring about the end of the Qing. Let us work together. At the same time, he turned to the terrified Manchu nobles in the Forbidden City. His message to them was equally stark. The mandate of heaven is clearly lost. The entire country is turned against you. You can either fight to the last man and meet the same bloody fate as the French monarchy, or you can accept the inevitable, abdicate with dignity, and allow me to negotiate a settlement that will guarantee your lives, your property, and your titles. He was simultaneously the revolutionaries' most dangerous enemy and their most powerful potential ally, the court's sole protector and its gravedigger. In late December 1911, Sun Yat-sen arrived back in China to a hero's welcome and was elected the first provisional president of the new Republic of China, with its capital in Nanjing. It was a moment of great symbolic power, but Sun knew his position was weak. He had the title and the legitimacy of the revolution, but he had no army that could challenge Yuan's Beiyang forces. His presidency was a hollow shell without military power. The final cynical deal was struck. Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionaries in Nanjing agreed that if Yuan could secure the abdication of the Manchu emperor, Sun would resign, and Yuan Shikai would become the president of the new unified republic. For Sun and his allies, this seemed like a necessary compromise. They believed it was the only way to avert a prolonged and devastating civil war and to finally get rid of the Qing dynasty. They hoped that once Yuan was president, they could control him through a new democratic constitution. It was a massive and ultimately fatal miscalculation. With this promise in hand, Yuan applied the final pressure in Beijing. He presented the court with the revolutionaries' articles of favorable treatment. It was a generous offer. The emperor would be allowed to keep his title, live in the Forbidden City, and would receive a massive annual stipend from the new republic. It was a golden cage, but a safe one. On February 12, 1912, in the Hall of Mental Cultivation within the Forbidden City, the final scene of a 2,000-year-old drama played out. The Empress Dowager Longyu, the widow of the Guangxu Emperor, sat on the throne, holding the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi on her lap. Before a small assembly of ministers and nobles, she reviewed the abdication edict, which Yuan Shikai had prepared. Overcome with emotion, she began to weep as she affixed the imperial seal to the document. The last emperor of China, too young to understand what was happening, was reportedly more concerned with why the adults around him were crying. With the stroke of a pen, the great Qing dynasty, and with it the entire imperial system of China that had begun with Qin Shi Huang in 221 BC, came to a quiet, anticlimactic end. It did not die in a blaze of glory or a last stand at the gates of the capital. It was negotiated out of existence by the very man it had empowered to save it. As promised, Sun Yat-sen resigned his post. On March 10, 1912, Yuan Shikai in Beijing took the oath of office as the second provisional president of the Republic of China. He had brilliantly played both sides against the middle, emerging with the ultimate prize. The man who had betrayed the emperor's reforms in 1898 had now become the leader of the revolution that overthrew the imperial system entirely. The dynasty's most powerful general had become the republic's first strongman. The revolutionaries in the South were jubilant. They believed they had won. They had created the first republic in Asia. They had a modern constitution, a parliament, and a president, but they failed to see the deep and dangerous irony of the situation. They had established a republic, but they had handed it over to a man who had spent his entire life mastering the arts of autocracy, not democracy. Yuan Shikai had no interest in sharing power, in listening to parliaments, or in the abstract ideals of liberty. He had merely used the revolution as a vehicle for his own ambition. The dragon throne was empty, but the autocratic soul of the old system had found a new host. The Republic of China was born, but its infancy would be spent in the shadow of a man who saw it not as a cause to be served, but as a prize to be owned. The struggle for China's future was far from over. Its fate now rested in the hands of its new, calculating master. In Beijing, Yuan Shikai took his presidential oath. The revolutionaries' dream, now his reality, their victory, his prize. To the idealists in the South, this was a necessary compromise, a temporary alliance with a strongman to unify the nation before the gentle work of building a democracy could begin. They failed to grasp a fundamental truth. Yuan Shikai had not accepted the presidency to serve the republic. He had accepted it to rule the country. The stage was now set for the republic's first and last great contest. A battle not of armies, but of ideas, pitting the power of the ballot box against the power of the gun, The year is 1912. The 2,000-year-old dragon throne lies empty. A new flag of 5 colored stripes representing the 5 main ethnicities of the nation flutters over China. For the first time in its long cyclical history of dynastic collapse and renewal, China was not just changing rulers, it was changing its very form of government. The Republic of China was a staggering, almost unbelievable achievement. Across the country, a generation of intellectuals, merchants, and students buzzed with a newfound energy. Political parties formed, newspapers flourished with vibrant and often harsh debate, and in the winter of 1912, China prepared for its first ever national parliamentary elections. For a brief, intoxicating moment, a democratic future for a quarter of humanity seemed possible. But this new fragile republic had a divided soul. While its heart was in the south, in the revolutionary fervor of Nanjing and the bustling commerce of Shanghai, its head was in the north. In Beijing, the old imperial capital, sat President Yuan Shikai. He was a man of the old world, a master of military force and political intrigue, who viewed the noisy, idealistic politicians of the South with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. He had not midwifed the republic out of a newfound belief in liberty. He had done so because it was the most efficient path to supreme power. And now, the instruments of that republic, a parliament, a constitution, and rival political parties, were beginning to get in his way. The stage was set for a collision between the man who held the power and the men who held the dream. The chief architect of the democratic dream was a man named Song Jiaoren. If Sun Yat-sen was the revolution's revered philosopher, Song was its brilliant political mechanic. He was a charismatic 30-year-old idealist, but also a masterful organizer. He knitted together the various revolutionary factions into a single, formidable political party, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party. Song Jiaoren was a true believer in the British-style parliamentary system. He argued that to prevent a new dictatorship, power should not rest with the president, but with a cabinet chosen by and responsible to the Parlement. The president, in his vision, would be a respected but largely ceremonial head of state, like the British monarch. The real power would lie with the prime minister, the leader of the majority party in the parliament. This was not an abstract political theory. It was a direct, public, and powerful challenge to Yuan Shikai. In the elections of late 1912 and early 1913, Song Jiaoren campaigned tirelessly, his eloquent speeches electrifying crowds. He promised a government that would be accountable to the people, that would build railways to unite the country, and that would stand up to foreign powers. The results were a landslide. The KMT won a commanding majority of seats in both houses of the new parliament. Song Jiaoren was the undisputed man of the hour, the prime minister in waiting. In March 1913, triumphant and full of plans, he prepared to travel from Shanghai to Beijing to form a new government and put his democratic, power-limiting agenda into action. He was, in his own words, going to take the whip to the presidential carriage. On the evening of March 20th, 1913, Song Jiaoren was at the Shanghai railway station, surrounded by friends and supporters, waiting to board the train to Beijing. As he walked toward the platform, a lone gunman stepped out from behind a pillar, fired a single shot into his back, and fled into the night. The bullet, laced with poison, had done devastating damage. Song collapsed, mortally wounded. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the surgeons knew his case was hopeless. Over the next 2 agonizing days, as his life slipped away, he demonstrated the depth of his commitment. He dictated a final telegram to his great rival, President Yuan Shikai, not with words of accusation, but with a final desperate plea for the future of the nation. I am dying now. I sincerely hope you will continue to uphold our country and with your utmost effort promote democracy and protect the people's livelihood. The country's future depends on you. The assassination sent a shockwave of horror and rage across China. A swift and surprisingly efficient police investigation caught the assassin and his handler within days. The trail of evidence they uncovered was damning. The assassin confessed he had been hired by a man who had connections to the government's chief of Secret Service. Telegraph messages were discovered that directly implicated Yuan's own prime minister. While there was no single piece of paper with Yuan's signature ordering the hit, the chain of command led unmistakably to his inner circle. No one in China or in the foreign legations had any doubt about who was ultimately responsible. Yuan Shikai had sent a message, written in blood on the floor of the Shanghai railway station. The message was clear. There would be no sharing of power. There would be no parliamentary checks on his authority. Political opposition would be met not with debate, but with a bullet. The murder of Song Jiaoren was not just the murder of a man. It was an act of political infanticide. The path of peaceful political change was now a dead end. The enraged KMT, led by a furious Sun Yat-sen, called for a second revolution to punish Yuan for his crime. In the summer of 1913, several southern provinces declared their independence. It was a righteous but futile gesture. The revolutionaries were disorganized, underfunded, and possessed no real army. Yuan Shikai, on the other hand, had the full might of the Beiyang army. He also had money. He had just secured a massive £25 million reorganization loan from a consortium of foreign banks, giving him the financial muscle to crush his domestic opponents. The foreign powers, who valued stability for their business interests far more than they valued democracy, were happy to back the strongman. The Second Revolution was a fiasco. Yuan's armies marched south and crushed the provincial rebels in less than 2 months. Sun Yat-sen, Song Jiaoren's great successor, was once again forced to flee into exile in Japan, a defeated and marginalized figure. With his opponents scattered, Yuan moved to dismantle the remaining machinery of the Republic. First, he formally declared the KMT a seditious organization and issued arrest warrants for its leaders. He then expelled every KMT member from the parliament. Without them, the parliament no longer had a quorum and could not legally convene. It became a hollow, useless shell, which he officially dissolved in early 1914. The vibrant, chaotic democratic experiment was over. Next, he replaced the provisional constitution with a new constitutional compact. This document effectively granted him unlimited dictatorial power. He could declare war, sign treaties, and appoint all officials without any legislative oversight. The presidential term was extended to 10 years with no limits on re-election, and the sitting president had the power to name his own successor. He had effectively made himself president for life, ruling China as an emperor in all but name. Yet for a man like Yuan Shikai, even this was not enough. By 1915, Yuan was at the absolute peak of his power. He was the undisputed dictator of China, surrounded by loyal generals and fawning courtiers. But this very isolation began to poison his judgment. Cut off from any genuine criticism, he began to believe his own propaganda, that he was the indispensable savior of the Chinese people, the one man who could restore China to its former glory. The noisy chaos of the brief parliamentary period, he argued, proved that the Chinese people were not ready for a republic. The nation, like a wayward child, needed a firm, fatherly hand. It needed an emperor. This ambition was stoked by those around him. His eldest son, Yuan Keding, was pathologically ambitious and dreamed of becoming crown prince. In a now infamous act of deception, he reportedly commissioned a special forged edition of a local newspaper to be printed each day, containing only articles that supported the revival of the monarchy and praised his father. This was the only newspaper the aging Yuan was allowed to read. A more sophisticated effort came from a group of scholars and officials led by a man named Yang Du. They formed a group called the Peace Planning Society, which began churning out pamphlets and articles arguing that a republic was a foreign, unsuitable system for China's national character. Only a return to monarchy, they claimed, could provide the stability and Confucian authority needed to hold the country together. This was the intellectual cover for a carefully orchestrated, nationwide political charade. A popular movement was manufactured. The provincial assemblies, all controlled by Yuan's military governors, began to submit petitions begging Yuan to take the throne for the good of the nation. A National People's Representative Assembly was convened, and in a comical display of fabricated democracy, they voted unanimously to offer the throne to Yuan Shikai. He had become the final victim of his own magnificent political theater, the master director who had become so lost in his own play that he mistook the applause of his paid actors for the genuine adoration of a nation. He convinced himself that this manufactured clamor was the genuine will of the people. He believed he was not seizing power but reluctantly accepting a sacred duty. On December 12, 1915, he performed the final rituals of this political theater. After modestly declining the offer once, he graciously accepted. He declared that the Republic of China would be officially brought to an end and a new dynasty, the Chinese Empire, would be established. The new reign was to be given the era name Hongxian, meaning great constitutional abundance. A lavish new throne was constructed and court officials began studying the intricate rituals of imperial ceremony. The date for the official enthronement was set for New Year's Day, 1916. Yuan Shikai had reached the summit. He had outmaneuvered the Qing, crushed the revolutionaries, and dismantled the republic. He had transformed himself from a failed scholar into a general, a prime minister, a president, and now an emperor. He was about to place upon his own head the dragon throne of China. He expected the adulation of a grateful nation. What he received instead was a firestorm of contempt and rebellion that would consume him. Having systematically dismantled the republic piece by piece, Yuan Shikai stood at last on the summit of his life's ambition. He had outwitted emperors and revolutionaries alike, trading a president's suit for the dragon robes he believed were his destiny. Surrounded by fawning sycophants and deceived by his own manufactured chorus of support, he listened for the sound of a grateful nation cheering his ascension. But the silence that greeted his imperial decree was not one of awe. It was the stunned, contemptuous silence before a hurricane. The man who thought he was inaugurating a new dynasty had instead lit the fuse on a rebellion that would consume him and shatter the country he claimed to be saving. The year 1916 dawned not with the crackle of celebratory fireworks for a new dynasty, but with the cold, ominous silence of a nation in shock. Yuan Shikai, now styling himself the Hongxian emperor, sat in the Forbidden City preparing for a lavish enthronement ceremony. He had meticulously planned his ascent using faked petitions, a rubber stamp assembly, and a manufactured wave of popular demand. He expected telegrams of congratulation, the submission of provincial governors, and the adulation of a people grateful to have a firm hand back at the helm. He had fundamentally, catastrophically misread the mood of the country he sought to rule. The reaction was not praise, but disgust. The man who claimed to be the great unifier had just committed the ultimate act of national betrayal. The Republic of China, for all its chaotic flaws and infantile democracy, had changed the country. The idea that sovereignty rested with the people, not in the divine right of an emperor, had taken root. To the new merchant class, to the students and intellectuals, and even to many of the common people, Yuan's move was a grotesque step backward into the feudal darkness they had just escaped. He was not seen as a new son of heaven, but as a traitor to the revolution, a thief of the nation, and most dangerously for him, the very men he had created, the powerful military governors of his own Beiyang army, saw his ambition not as a stabilizing force, but as a direct threat to their own power. The firestorm was about to begin. The first spark of rebellion did not come from the exiled revolutionaries, like Sun Yat-sen, who were largely marginalized and powerless. It came from within Yuan's own sphere of influence, in the distant southwestern province of Yunnan. The leader was a brilliant, charismatic 33-year-old general named Kai Yi Kai, was a product of the modern military academies, and had once looked to Yuan as a leader. But as Yuan's dictatorial ambitions grew, Kai became disillusioned. Yuan, recognizing Kai's influence, had kept him in a form of polite house arrest in Beijing. In a dramatic escape, Kai slipped out of the capital and made the arduous journey back to his home province. There, he joined forces with the provincial governor, and on December 25, 1915, they sent a telegram to Beijing demanding the cancellation of the monarchy. When Yuan refused, they declared the independence of Yunnan and the beginning of the National Protection War. They were not alone. Their actions were given immense intellectual firepower by one of the most famous scholars in China, Liang Qichao. Liang had been a leader of the failed 1898 reforms and had initially supported Yuan's presidency, believing a strong man was needed to guide China. But the imperial bid was a betrayal he could not stomach. His blistering public essays denouncing Yuan and defending the republic spread throughout the country, galvanizing opposition. At first, Yuan Shikai scoffed at the rebellion. How could a poor, remote province like Yunnan possibly challenge the might of his Beiyang army? He dispatched 2 of his commanders with a large force to crush the uprising. But what happened next was his worst nightmare. The rebellion began to spread like a virus through the body politic. The neighboring provinces of Guizhou and Guangxi soon declared independence and joined the fight. More alarmingly, Yuan's own Beiyang commanders began to mutiny not with their voices, but with their feet. The generals he had sent to quell the rebellion fought with a conspicuous lack of enthusiasm. Other powerful Beiyang governors, like Feng Guozhang, began to publicly express their doubts about the monarchy. They understood what Yuan, in his imperial bubble, did not. They were effectively semi-independent kings in their own provinces under the loose structure of the republic. A powerful new emperor in Beijing would mean a re-centralization of authority, a threat to their autonomy and their revenues. They preferred a weak republic that left them in charge to a strong empire that would make them mere subjects. The machine Yuan had built to acquire power was now being used to deny him his ultimate prize. The foreign powers also abandoned him. Japan, eager to see China remain weak and divided, secretly funneled money and weapons to the southern rebels. The British, Americans, and others signaled that they would not recognize his new dynasty. Yuan was utterly alone. By March 1916, the situation was catastrophic. More provinces had declared independence. The Beiyang army was proving unreliable. The national treasury was empty. The Hongxian Empire was a fantasy, a paper monarchy that ruled little outside the walls of the Forbidden City. The man who had meticulously planned every step of his rise to power had walked off a cliff. On March 22, 1916, facing universal opposition and the desertion of his most trusted lieutenants, a deeply humiliated Yuan Shikai signed another edict. After a reign of just 83 days, he officially abolished the Chinese Empire and announced that he was resuming his post as President of the Republic. It was perhaps the most pathetic, anticlimactic end to an imperial dream in history. But it was too late. The act of taking off the crown did not restore his authority. It only confirmed his weakness and failure. His enemies, smelling blood, were not satisfied. They demanded his resignation from the presidency as well. The very foundations of his power had crumbled. The Beiyang generals, who had once sworn personal loyalty to him, now openly defied him. His orders were ignored. He was a president with no power, a general with no army, a strong man who was no longer strong. The immense stress and public humiliation shattered him, body and soul. The robust, imposing man began to waste away. He was consumed by fits of rage and long periods of deep depression. His chronic kidney disease flared up violently. In his final lucid moments, he is said to have wept with regret, blaming the sycophants who had pushed him toward the throne. "They have destroyed me," he lamented, referring to his ambitious son and the organizers of the fake monarchist movement. On the morning of June 6, 1916, Yuan Shikai died at the age of 56. The official cause was uremia, total kidney failure. But the true cause was a broken spirit and the collapse of a lifetime of ambition. Yuan Shikai had believed that without him, China would fall apart. His death proved him right in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He was the only man with the prestige and authority, the center of gravity, to hold the powerful, mutually suspicious Beiyang commanders together. With him gone, the center dissolved. His great creation, the Beiyang army, immediately shattered into rival factions, each led by one of his top lieutenants. These factions, known as cliques, seized control of different regions of the country and began to fight each other for control of the powerless central government in Beijing. China descended into the warlord era, a dark age of division, chaos, and relentless civil war that would last for over a decade. The country was torn apart by men like Duan Qirui, Chao Kun, and Zhang Zuolin, fighting pointless, brutal wars for power and profit. Millions died from combat, famine, and disease. The dream of a unified modern China seemed more distant than ever. The ultimate tragic irony of Yuan Shikai's life is this: the man who rose to power by creating China's first modern army and who briefly unified the nation was, in the end, the architect of its complete disintegration. So who was Yuan Shikai? A villain who strangled a young republic in its cradle, or a tragic figure, a product of a chaotic time who genuinely believed only an iron fist could save China from itself? He was both. He was a man of immense talent, a brilliant administrator and a military modernizer who possessed none of the vision or ideals necessary to be a nation builder. He was caught between two worlds: the ancient traditions of imperial power he sought to revive for his own glory, and the modern forces of nationalism and revolution that he unleashed but could never control. He was the embodiment of China's own agonizing struggle between its imperial past and its republican future. This raises the eternal question of history. Was he a man of free will whose personal ambition and fatal betrayals doomed a nation to decades of suffering? Or was he a man of fate, a figure of immense strength and profound flaws thrown up by a broken era, destined to play his tragic part in a larger, more complex story? He rose from the ruins of a dying empire and, for a moment, held the destiny of a quarter of humanity in his hands. But in the end, the man who tried to become the master of China's fate became just another ghost in its long, turbulent, and unfinished story.